Almost every day, cold cases that were once unsolved finally get the evidence, witnesses, or confessions needed for police to solve the case. Years or even decades later, the victims and their families finally get justice. Number 5. In 2020, a homeless man confessed to a crime that had remained unsolved for almost 40 years. With few leads to go on, police had closed the case in 1985, but were finally able to bring justice to the victim. It was 1983 when Christopher Ainscought's body was found in his flat in northwest London. Police had gone to check on him after he failed to show up for work. Blunt force attacks had caused his passing, and police believed a marble ashtray that was found in the flat was one of the weapons used. The crime scene was described as brutal. There was little evidence found at the flat. There were no fingerprints, but police did collect a cigarette butt in one of the ashtrays in case there was any evidence they could use. 2 years later, when no further leads had turned up, and not even a next of kin could be found, the case was closed. That was until 2020. Anthony Kemp had lived a violent criminal life. In 1980, he was arrested for owning an illegal weapon and spent much of his life in and out of prison on burglary convictions. He had also previously used illegal substances. At the age of 59, faced with becoming homeless, Kemp finally decided to confess to a crime he'd kept a secret for 37 years. He had met Christopher at a bar. Christopher had been warned by friends not to invite strangers to his home so often, but he didn't listen to this advice and brought Kemp back to his flat. There they had an argument, though Kemp claimed that he couldn't remember what it was about and Kemp attacked him. After he had taken Christopher's life, he wiped down all the surfaces he had touched and fled the scene. Now he was confessing because he decided he would rather spend the rest of his life in prison than remain homeless. But for some reason, Kemp then retracted his confession. He instead blamed the crime on one of his accomplices from a robbery in the 1980s. This accomplice had already passed away in prison, but DNA testing on the cigarette left at the scene of the crime confirmed that it had been Kemp, not his accomplice, who had been there. After this, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Number 4. Sometime in late 1960, Peter Rain Bart made his wife disappear. 20 years later, her disappearance remains unsolved, and Rain Bart thought he'd gotten away with his crime. Even when his lover went to the police, nothing was done. Then workers at a peat plant made a gruesome discovery. Rain Bart met Malika Maria de Fernandez in 1959. She was a portrait artist who loved traveling. He was an airline executive who'd been trying to hide his homosexuality. At the time, homosexuality was still against the law and would be for years. Within hours of meeting, Rain Bart proposed. A few days later, the two were married. Unsurprisingly, it was a loveless marriage. They spent a few months together in Manchester, where they rented a home. After a few short months, Malika returned to traveling, and Rain Bart moved into a cottage with a male lover. The cottage was on the outskirts of the small town of Wimslow and was surrounded by a peat bog. In late 1960, Malika returned. According to Rain Bart, she wanted more money and threatened to expose his sexuality if she didn't get it. Rain Bart flew into a rage and took Malika's life. He tried to burn her remains, but for some reason that didn't work. So instead, he scattered them in the bog. For years, Rain Bart got on with his life. Police suspected that he was responsible for his wife's disappearance and dug up his garden in search of a body, but nothing turned up. Rain Bart would leave the area and was involved in other crimes. One of his accomplices told police Rain Bart had confessed to taking Malika's life. Rain Bart was brought in for questioning but denied it, and the matter went no further. He had not long been released from prison for an unrelated crime when human remains were found in the bog in May of 1983. Ever since the 15th century, the bog around Wilmslow had been the site of peat harvesting for fuel and fertilizer. After the Industrial Revolution, it was automated, but workers were on the site to make sure nothing that could damage the machinery was used. It was these workers that found what they thought was a ball. After cleaning it up, they were horrified to find it was actually the partially preserved remains of a skull. Police were called and immediately believed the remains belonged to Malika. Finally, Rainbart confessed to the crime he had thought he'd gotten away with. But there was another twist to the story. The skull was sent to Oxford University for analysis. They discovered that the woman it had belonged to had actually lived almost 2,000 years earlier. Realizing this wasn't Malika, Rainbart tried to retract his confession, but he was still found guilty for the crime. Malika's body has never been found. The following year, more remains were discovered, but these belonged to a man who had also lived in Roman Britain. His passing was also the result of a crime, but one that took place hundreds of years ago. Number 3. For 22 years, the end of Elaine Grahams' life was an unsolved crime. It wasn't until 2003 that cold case detectives finally solved the crime. Elaine was 29 years old when she disappeared in March of 1983. She was a part-time nurse studying at California State University. She was married to a doctor, and together they had a 2-year-old daughter. The morning of March 17th started off completely normal. Elaine dropped off her daughter with the babysitter and went to university. This was the last that anyone saw or heard from her. Elaine was soon reported missing, and even before her body was found, police had a suspect. Elaine's body was found 8 months later by hikers in the Browns Canyon. The discovery brought more circumstantial evidence against the suspect, but it wasn't enough to prosecute. Without any additional evidence, the case went cold. The criminal walked free for more than 20 years. When cold case detectives reopened the case, the first step was to look at the original suspect. Edmund J. Marr had been in his early 20s at the time of the crime. He went into the Army, following in the steps of his father who had passed away when he was a child. On the 21st anniversary of his father's passing, Marr was kicked out of the Army for using illegal substances. Marr did not react well. The following day, he crossed paths with Elaine at the university. Marr abducted her and took her life. At first, Marr was suspected because he'd been at the university around the time of the disappearance, and near where the car was found the following day. Then he was arrested for a robbery and a bladed weapon was found. After Elaine's body was discovered, it emerged that she'd been attacked with a similar weapon. Unfortunately, DNA testing wasn't good enough to determine if this was the exact blade used in the attack. When the case was reopened, DNA was retested. It found Elaine's DNA was on Marr's weapon. New witnesses also came forward. Marr was arrested again, and this time he pleaded guilty to the crime. In 2003, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Why he chose to commit such a terrible crime has never been revealed, but at least the criminal faced justice after decades. Number 2. In 1998, Falls Township had an unsolved crime that they were desperate to see solved. What was once thought to be a robbery gone wrong was discovered to be something much darker. On the morning of February 4th, 1984, the day manager of a Roy Roger restaurant in Philadelphia walked into a crime scene. Terry Brooks, the night manager, had been attacked in an extremely violent manner. The safe had been tampered with, and the takings from the day were missing. Police believed the crime was a robbery gone wrong. They found fingerprints and DNA under Terry's fingernails, but none of the evidence matched anything on record. From what police could make out, there hadn't been anything unusual seen the previous day. Terry had stayed behind to do paperwork. The other employees left at 1 a.m. Terry locked the door, then called her fiancé. Then the robbery happened. The case went cold, and 14 years later, it was brought to the Vidic Society. Here, detectives didn't think the case was a robbery. The attack looked too much to be the work of someone who wasn't only there for money, and they believed the attack was personal. They also believed Terry likely knew her attacker. There was no sign of forced entry, meaning she'd let them in herself. All evidence had pointed to a boyfriend. After talking to Terry's parents and looking at the funeral register, they found the name of the fiancé, Alfred Scott Keefe. Keefe had moved to nearby Warminster by this point. Police were able to get the address because he'd recently been arrested for driving under the influence. But Keefe fitting the profile wasn't enough to arrest him. Police collected trash from Keefe's home and found cigarette butts. They were the same brand that Keefe had with him during the driving offense. They tested the saliva on the butts, and police confirmed that they'd been smoked by the same person, who had taken Terry's life years earlier. After eliminating Keefe's brother as a suspect, Keefe was arrested. During interrogation, he confessed, and in 2000, he was handed a life sentence. Number 1. In November of 1986, an elderly Oklahoma couple hired divers to search Claremore Lake for an antique car that had been pushed into the water decades earlier. What divers found instead, under 11 feet of water, was a body. The person had significant damage to their head, making identification through dental records impossible, and they'd been underwater too long to be recognizable. But what police did have was a theory for who this mysterious John Doe was. In July, Frank Ross had failed to show up for work at his brother's grocery store in Stillwell. He had just traveled to Claremore to visit family. His family reported him missing on July 31st and had spent the last few months searching for him. With no way of identifying the body, it was buried as a John Doe. Years later, as DNA testing improved, a new witness came forward, and the case was finally solved. The first step came in 1992. A woman who'd been dating a man named James Kent Hill told police that Hill had confessed to taking Ross's life. On the night Ross disappeared, he'd come home upset and scared, and with a red substance on his clothing. He told her that he'd met a man at the bar and for some reason offered him a life somewhere. In the car, Ross had supposedly made a romantic pass at Hill. Hill had pulled over and violently attacked him with a rock and a bladed weapon. He'd specifically tried to make it harder for the body to be identified. He then weighed it down and dumped it in Claremore Lake. The body was exhumed and new DNA testing was used, comparing the remains with Ross's mother. The technique was so new, Oklahoma courts weren't even certain it was able to be used as evidence. But the testing did confirm the body belonged to Ross. With an almost 10-year-old disappearance solved, the family was now appealing for witnesses to help solve the crime. In 1995, police finally had enough evidence to arrest Hill. He eventually confessed and was convicted for the now solved crime. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.